In this tutorial, we're going to be learning about JavaScript scopes. I'm going to be using a text editor called Atom and a behavior-driven unit test framework called Jasmine to help demonstrate the concept of variable scopes. So JavaScript scopes are a very fundamental yet very misunderstood part of the JavaScript language. In this tutorial, I'm going to focus on variable scopes, but the same concepts can be used with functions and classes and pretty much anything else in JavaScript. Now, technically speaking, a scope is the current context of execution, the context in which variables and expressions are visible or can be referenced. Now here at the top of this file we're going to be working in, I simply said the context in which variables are accessible. And that's probably the simplest way to think of variable scopes. So the structure of this file is very simple. We have two global variables here at the top, and then we have two test functions here. Jasmine calls these functions describe. And then we run our test by simply typing in npm test. And there we go. The green dots tell us that our tests have passed. Now let's go ahead and dive into these test functions. So we'll start with this one here. Now in JavaScript, there's technically only two types of scopes. One is global, and the other one can be called either function or local. There's also a subtype of scope variable, which some people like to call public and private. There's a lot of different things to call these scopes. I'm just going to call them outer scopes and inner scopes. But before we talk about those scopes, let's talk about the global scope. Now, as you can imagine, a global variable scope can be declared outside of the actual function. So if you look at this file, you can see that these variables, of course one is a constant, so these assignments are living outside of the actual code. They're literally sitting here on top of the file. JavaScript considers these global variables, and they can be used anywhere inside of this file. So you can see this is tested with these two functions here. In this test, it uses global variable scope. We expect that the global scope is not undefined. Undefined is the type that's returned when you try to call a variable that hasn't been assigned to anything. So as you can see, global scope is being defined up here. So let's go ahead and let's take the assignment away. Let's save it. And now let's rerun the tests. And now we can see that every test that expected global scope to be defined failed because the test expected undefined not to be undefined. So let's go ahead and reassign a value to global scope. And let's move on to local variable scopes. In this case, I use the term inner and outer. A lot of people use public and private, and even more people don't really differentiate between the two types of variable scopes. So in this case, an outer local variable scope has a variable that's declared within an actual function in such a way that functions within this function can access it. Now, on the other hand, an inner local variable scope has a variable that's declared inside of a sub-function. So this is a function that is declared within this function, which means that this variable cannot be accessed within, for example, this function or this function. It can only be accessed from within this function because this is where it's declared. Now, like the previous test, both of these functions are expecting the global scope variable and the global scope constant to not be undefined. But the outer local variable scope test is expecting the outer function scope variable, which is again defined here, to not be undefined. And then with the inner local variable scope test, we're expecting the inner function scope variable, which is declared here, to not be undefined. And if we run our tests, and as you can see, the tests pass because our inner and outer scopes are in fact defined, and that's what our tests are checking for. So now let's go ahead and cover block variable scopes. Now the first thing that you'll notice about block variable scopes is that instead of using the var statement, we use the let statement. This was introduced with ES6, as was const, and neither let or const are used widely in JavaScript right now, but there's a lot of really cool things and optimizations you can do with your JavaScript code if you do use let, and I can cover that in another video. But in the context of this function here, let is being used as a block scope. Now what's interesting about block scopes is that nothing can use this particular variable but code within this block being the if statement. So if we take this variable block scope and try to use it here, we'll run our tests, and you'll see that the test failed because block scope is not defined. Well, of course it's defined here within this block. But this test couldn't access it because it's not within this block. So let's go ahead and roll that back, and let's run the test again. Now it goes without saying that you don't have to use the statement yet. I can go ahead and replace let with var and run the tests, and the code works just fine. Both the statements const and let are optimization techniques to make your JavaScript run better. You don't actually have to use them. So you might be wondering what this second describe function is, and I was going to use this section to kind of demonstrate the negative test cases, where we're actually checking to see if these variables are undefined, but this is a really terrible pattern, and you shouldn't ever write tests like this anyways, and I don't even want to show you these tests because they're so bad, so I'm going to go ahead and delete them. But that just about covers JavaScript scopes. Now, if you're new to JavaScript and you're just kind of hacking around, don't worry too much about scoping. But if you're ever planning on contributing to an open source JavaScript framework or library, or planning on doing anything professionally with JavaScript, understanding scopes and how they work is absolutely essential, both for having bug-free code, but also very performant code. Like I said, there's very large performance impacts when you use const and let over var, especially in blocks and things. But that's it for this tutorial. If you liked it and you learned something, feel free to leave me a comment, like, and subscribe on the video, and thanks a bunch for watching.